Hey, before we dive into this week's episode, do you mind taking 5 seconds of your time to rate and review us on your favorite podcast platform? It will really help other people find this podcast, and I would also love your feedback. Thank you for taking the time, and now let's dive into the episode. Hello and welcome to the Marketing Women Podcast. I'm your host, Samusha Khandan, and it's great to have you here. Are you looking to move into marketing or want to learn marketing from scratch? We discuss all things marketing, analytics, business, personal branding, and much more in a way any layman can understand. If you're new here, make sure to follow along and get on that email list by visiting anushakhandan.com/email list. Follow at AnushaRK on TikTok, tag us on your stories, would love to see that. And now let's dive in. In today's episode, we are going to talk about the journey, the life cycle, and the mindset behind launching something new. And it does not matter what you're launching, okay? It could be a podcast, it could be a newsletter, it could be an actual product, it could be a service, whatever it is. We're going to talk about the spark of an idea and through that until the launch day when you're really anxious and then beyond. I will first start off this episode by telling you a little bit story about how the Marketing Woman podcast and the Pivot to Balance podcast came to life. And then we'll move into 6 segments where we'll talk about the mindsets and everything else. So, story time. The Marketing Women podcast is pretty fun, right? But the journey, it took a long time to get there. The Marketing Women podcast is something I thought about, I think 3 or 4 years ago. And I used to sit in my bedroom in Chennai, India, and I would just record stuff on my phone, just be talking to myself like a crazy person. And I always talk to myself. So if you ever see me talking to myself, I'm not crazy. I'm just having a meeting with myself, okay? That's how the Marketing Women podcast started. I used to explain concepts to myself, and then I would go back and listen to it just to see, am I actually able to tell people what I know? Because I believe that if you cannot tell something, if you cannot explain something that you know to a 3-year-old or a 5-year-old or a 10-year-old, you don't really know what you're doing. That is the mindset that I have. The podcast before was a blog called Sensible Scoop, which was, again, a blog called Anusha Navigates, which was, before that, it was Anusha Shares blogspot.com or something. So from Anusha Shares, it became Anusha Navigates became Sensible Scoop, and Sensible Scoop became the Marketing Women podcast and the Pivot to Balance podcast. It has been quite the journey. But to get there, when you have something, an idea, it can be so nerve-wracking to actually start it, to actually tell people. And I recently made a TikTok where I said, when I first started my blog, Sensible Scoop, I never really told anybody, which was a great move, a big step for me at that point. But I never really told anybody because I was very scared of what people might think. And it's crazy that the blog actually really did well, even though I never told anybody. None of my friends went and checked it out. I don't think they did because I never told anybody. I got a lot of organic reach, surprisingly. But then I realized that I actually like talking a lot. I like having this personal, you're actually listening to my voice, or when I do video podcasts, you're able to see my face. I liked that. I like that aspect of doing a podcast, and that's how it became. But there are so many other things that go, into having an idea and to executing it and then sustaining it and then listening to what people are saying about you. How do you make changes along the way as you go, right? All of these things go into building something new. So let's get into segments. That's what's going to be interesting. So let's get into that. Segment 1, we'll talk about like the basics, like the setting the foundation part. It all starts with an idea, right? Imagine a quiet evening, much like when I first thought of Sensible Scoop. Alone with my thoughts, the idea came softly, but filled me with excitement. Just kidding. Turning this idea into reality, any idea into reality, requires 2 things. The first thing is a leap of faith. You just have to take that first step. It's super hard to have an idea and then have all these million questions in your head thinking, what if that goes wrong? What if nobody actually listens to my podcast? What if nobody subscribes to my newsletter, which is actually going to come out pretty soon? Keep an eye out for that. What if nobody's interested in whatever it is that I'm doing? Yeah, don't care about that. Just do it. Take that leap of faith. And the second thing is planning. And I don't mean planning in the way of, oh, you need to have a marketing plan or you need to have everything figured out. No, just a little bit of planning, an outline, a roadmap. Just scribble something on your whiteboard. I'll tell you today how to move from ideation to execution with a little bit of strategy and a lot of passion. So here I'll give you a tip. First, start off by mapping out your idea. Think of it as like, where do you want to go? Where does it begin? Just start there. Slowly build your narrative. You'll learn the ropes and you'll be a pro at it before you even know it. Let's move into segment 2 and we'll talk about developing your MVP. Remember, not every detail needs to be perfect from the start, like I said, because when I launched the Marketing Women podcast, I started pretty simple, just basic equipment and raw passion. The minimum viable product, which is MVP, it's about testing the waters, gathering data, and refining as you go. So MVP is nothing but like a demo of what you've created. Well, it's actually not a demo. A demo is like showing that a concept can be built. MVP is you showing it actually built. It's like being able to actually interact with whatever it is that you're building. For example, for the podcast, MVP would be actually being able to listen to the podcast with the intro, the outro. It may be it may not be very well produced, but it's still something they can listen to, right? So let's say for an application, you need not have everything figured out, but I should be able to test it out. So it's developed so that you can use it. The end users can actually see it and test it out. It's like a trial period. What you can do here, and my tip here for you, is to start sharing your MVP with your small audience, like an exclusive preview, make it seem like that. And it really is an exclusive preview. Take what they're saying, gather their impressions, and use that feedback as your guiding compass. As a dancer, I've always been trained to do rehearsals before going on stage. I actually hate that. I don't like rehearsing anything. But when it comes to building something, you need to have your own focus group that can tell you, hey, this is what we like about this. This is what we don't like about this. And keep this in mind. When you are recruiting people to be your focus group, you've got to understand if they understand what it is you're doing. So this is how I would suggest you do it. Have 50% of the crowd be people that will actually understand what it is that you're doing. And 50% of the people, let them be people that won't understand it at all. Because your ideal customer might not always know that they have a problem. So when you tell them, they need to be able to understand that. And how would you communicate to that kind of customer? That's an important aspect that you need to gather when you're actually starting to build your MVP. There. Now let's move into segment 3, where the whole excitement is building for you. You have your product, you know what you're doing, you have your focus group, everything else. I have the product, I have my podcast, but how do I make sure that someone actually buys it, tries it, listens to it, engages with it just a little bit? A mistake that I did with Sensible Scoop was I never told anybody. But with the Marketing Win podcast, I slowly started telling people. A lot of people, especially in Boston, because I was in Boston at the time, I started telling them, like, I'm actually starting to build something. I'm actually starting to build something. And I never told anybody what it was. And then I started telling them, I have ideas to build podcasts. And people were instantly intrigued. They were like, what do you mean podcast? And it was kind of exciting to see that, wow, the thing that's been in my head for like 3 years is actually coming out, and I'm actually telling people that. That was crazy. But that also meant I'm holding myself accountable to something that I've wanted to do for a while. And then I announced it broadly. I had a trailer, a teaser for the podcast, and that got so much engagement. And a lot of people had a lot of opinions on them. And it was great for me because I got a preview of what people might think when they actually listen to the podcast. And this is what you're supposed to do. You're supposed to build the excitement and take the feedback that they're giving you. In this stage, I will also say that if you're trying to have investors invest in your business, one thing that I will tell you is think about yourself in that situation. Would you want to invest in what you're doing? Would you spend that much amount of money on your project? Like, be completely honest with yourself. Because a lot of the times we start building something and we think, oh, someone should invest in this. If I have the money, I can do better. But you don't even know if you can do better. That is something we should all think about. So what you can do here, the tip is to craft a compelling story around your project. I can tell you this. When you have a story around why you're building something, why you're doing what you're doing, it draws people into it. It does not matter if they're your customers or if they're your investors. Your narrative should always resonate with their desires and their aspirations. It's not about you. You're listening to this podcast because you want to learn something, not because you want to know about me. You want to learn something. You always have to give people what they need, not what you think they need. Two completely different things. Now let's move into segment 4, which is the pre-launch phase. Now the stage is nearly set. The audience, they're getting restless. The anticipation is building. And this is the pre-launch phase, where you've actually just made people curious at this point. And you're using social media teasers, countdowns, sneak peeks to build anticipation for whatever it is that you're building. Here my tip is, create a buzz by involving your audience in the countdown. Let them be part of your journey. Turn passive observers into active participants. When you invest in your people, people will invest in you. That is the number one key to any pre-launching phase. You can't just go out there and say, oh, I have my podcast on, go listen to it. No. You guys are the reason I'm doing this podcast is because you've been so supportive. And I'm not saying this to be fake. And I actually mean this with the Marketing Women podcast. That is what drives me. And that is why it's easy for me to resonate with a lot of my listeners. So that's the pre-launch phase. Now the launch day. Oh my God, it is so exhilarating to be on that day. And I think it's this culmination of hard work and all the hopes that you have. Everything needs to be in sync. It's like, oh, I've rehearsed so well for my dance performance. The launch of a Marketing Woman podcast was just me on campus, having my classes. I was working part-time, 2 part-time jobs, and it was just nerve-wracking. But I will always celebrate that day. I actually took myself out and had a donut or something to celebrate it. I think it's important, especially if you have a team that's working with you. You need to let them know their role and also celebrate them, because everyone wants to be a part of celebrations, okay? Everyone wants to be a part of something big. So it's very important, just like how you're including your audience, you've got to include your team members. And on launch day, before launch day, actually, in the pre-launch phase, I would also add this: take the time to appreciate whatever it is that you've built, because it's a huge testament to who you are as a person, who you are as a professional, your mindset. That is so important. And on launch day, remember to please celebrate. Remember to take things with a pinch of salt. Don't take every single feedback too seriously. And don't let all these compliments get to your head. This is something that's it's very easy to happen, right? When people are congratulating you and telling you. And yes, it is a big deal, no matter what it is you're launching it, whether it's a blog, whether it's a newsletter, it does not matter. It's still a big deal to you, but don't let that cloud your judgment. Let's move into segment 6, and we'll talk about the last phase, which is now you've done all the work. You've had an idea, you converted that into MVP, you've actually included everybody in your process, you've prepared for the process, you launched whatever it is that you wanted to launch. It's all done. Now it's sustaining. Now nobody is looking at what you're doing, but you still have a business. You still have a passion that you're following. It's still in you. Just because you've launched your podcast or just because you've launched your newsletter or your business does not mean you're done with it, right? You have to continue. Post-launch is about keeping the energy alive. To this day, I still ask people, hey, what did you think about the episode? Hey, did you like it? And I can tell when people like it, when people don't like it. And I always evolve my content based on your feedback, which is why it's so important for me to hear from you. It was so difficult to know what I was doing with Sensible Scoop, what I was doing right, what I was doing wrong, because I never really told anybody, never gave anyone the space to come and tell me what they were thinking, which was a great learning. So when you're in that post-launch phase, yes, you have to sustain momentum. You have to keep it going. You have to be consistent. You have to be disciplined. But another really important part is feedback loop. The feedback loop part is so important. Ask people their thoughts. Listen, feedback loop can be very different for very different businesses, right? For the podcast, I can ask you guys to tell me You can email me. You can go to anushakhanna.com/the Marketing Woman Podcast Hub, and you can tell me what you think. But with a lot of businesses, that's not the case. There are way different approaches for actually asking people to give their feedback. And when you have a million customers, it's still important to get their thoughts. Because when you include people in the process, they can see their suggestions come to life and they will love it. And that will create ongoing dialogue, which will create a community instead of a customer base. I think you guys will understand that this touches a little bit on customer advocacy, touches a little bit on customer-led growth. That happens when you include your customers as a part of the process. So those are the 6 segments that I had for you. So let's take a moment to recap the key stages. So we've journeyed through launching something new to actually keeping the momentum going. So it started with an idea, and then we created MVP. We tested everything, and then we built excitement. We started engaging with potential customers, supporters, investors. And then we had the pre-launch phase where we were talking about increasing curiosity, building anticipation. And then the launch day, it talks about the importance of coordination, celebration, where you're kind of like it's a marking of, you're marking the culmination of all your hard work and passion. And then you have the post-launch segment where it really stressed upon sustaining momentum and engaging in continuous feedback loop. So that has been such an amazing journey, right? If you've ever started something and you've been through any of these stages, I would love to hear from you. Please let me know. I would love to hear from you. You can email me at anusha@anushakhanna.com. I will get back to you ASAP. So I'm excited to hear from you. Season 5 has been such an amazing start. I love it. I love the support. Thank you so much. And with that, I will see you next week in the next episode. If you find it useful, please feel free to reach out to me on LinkedIn or email me at anusha@anushakhanna.com. Follow me on LinkedIn to never miss my journey, and I'll see you in the next episode. Peace.